The committee will come to order, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for being here bright and early. And I want to welcome you to this, what I believe and we believe to be a very important hearing on anti-Semitism and combating anti-Semitism, with a particular emphasis on Europe. At a congressional hearing that I chaired in 2002 on combating anti-Semitism, Dr. Shimon Samuels of the Wiesenthal Center in Paris testified and said, and I quote, "The Holocaust for 30 years after the war acted as a protective Teflon against blatant anti-Semitic expression, especially in Europe. That Teflon," he said, "has eroded, and what was considered distasteful and politically incorrect is becoming simply an opinion." But he warned ominously, cocktail chatter at fine English dinners can end in Molotov cocktails against synagogues. In response to what appeared to be a sudden, frightening spike in anti-Semitism in several countries, including here in the United States, we first proposed the idea for a conference on combating anti-Semitism under the auspices of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Convinced that we had an escalating crisis on our hands, we teamed with several OSCE partners to push for action and reform. Many of the people and the NGOs present in this room played a leading part. Rabbi Baker will remember so well how we worked on several important initiatives, including language as plans of action. These efforts directly led to important OSCE conferences on combating anti-Semitism. And as I think many of you know, they occurred in places like Vienna, Berlin, Cordoba, and Bucharest. In each of those, participating states have made solemn, tangible commitments to put our words into action. In some countries, progress has been made, yet the scope and outcome of anti-Semitic acts has not abated in others, and in some nations it has actually gotten worse. That is why we are here today, to review, to recommit, and to re-energize efforts to vanquish the highly disturbing resurgence of anti-Semitism everywhere, including in Europe. Unparalleled since the dark days of the Second World War, Jewish communities on a global scale are facing verbal harassment and sometimes violent attacks against synagogues, Jewish cultural sites, cemeteries, and individuals. It is an ugly reality that won't go away by ignoring it or by wishing it away. It must be defeated. Thus, we gather to enlighten, motivate, and share best practices on how not just to mitigate this centuries-old obsession, but to crush this pernicious form of hate. From our first panel of witnesses, we are going to hear how anti-Semitism directly threats not only Jews, but also Christians and Muslims and democracy and civil society. We are all in this together. When we fight anti-Semitism, it's not only a matter of justice for Jewish fellow citizens, but also standing up for Christianity and for Islam and for the possibility of a decent living itself. We all have a direct stake in the fight against anti-Semitism. This is tragically clear in the Middle East countries where the governments propagate anti-Semitism as an official or quasi-official ideology. These governments incite anti-Semitic hatred of Israel in order to distract the people from their own tyrannical rule and from their own abuse of human rights. Denial of democracy, economic corruption, and the like. Sadly, it works. We see this in governments as varied as those of Iran in Egypt, Pakistan and Syria, and Saudi Arabia, and the list, of course, doesn't end there. Tens of millions of people who live in these communities are, in this sense, suffering from anti-Semitism. Few of them are Jewish. Most are Muslims. Millions are Christian. It's true that to some degree or other, many of the people in these countries have bought into the evil of anti-Semitism, but many, thankfully, have not. From our second panel, we are also going to hear reports from a number of European Jewish leaders who will be able to tell us firsthand about anti-Semitism in their countries and the region, and how the governments are responding and whether these responses are effective and adequate. Sadly, in much of Europe, the harassment of Jews, including verbal and physical violence, continues to increase. And a recent Anti-Defamation League study shows that anti-Semitic attitudes are widespread in Europe and getting worse in many countries. One thing the witnesses will address is whether elected officials are fulfilling their responsibility to speak out publicly against any expression of anti-Semitic hate. When national leaders fail to denounce anti-Semitic violence and slurs, the void is not only demoralizing to the victims, but silence actually enables the wrongdoing. Silence by elected officials in particular conveys approval or at least acquiescence and can contribute to a climate of fear and a profound sense of vulnerability. Another point we have to consider is whether the countries are collecting reliable hate crime information. We can't fight anti-Semitic crimes effectively unless we have reliable information on them. The most recent figures from the United States, for example, which are collected by the FBI, show that Jews, although they're only 2% of the United States population, are the victims of 63% of religiously targeted hate crimes. An additional concern is the importance of Holocaust education. If we are to protect our children from the dark evil of anti-Semitism, we must re-educate ourselves and systematically educate our children. While that starts in our homes, the classroom must be an incubator of tolerance and respect. It seems to me that only the most hardened racists can remain unmoved by Holocaust education and remembrance. Only the most crass, evil, and prejudiced among us can study the horrors of the Holocaust and not cry out, "Never again." Yet another concern is the rise of the new anti-Semitism, which tries to pass itself off as a legitimate criticism of Israel, but which demonizes, delegitimizes, and applies double standards against Israel, former Soviet refusenik Natan Sharansky's 3Ds. In any case, this form of anti-Semitism appears to be spreading among European social democratic and leftist parties, as well as among Muslim immigrants from the Middle East, and I'd like to hear the views of our distinguished witnesses on that as well. I look forward to our witnesses' statements, and I would ask unanimous consent that my full statement be made a part of the record. Without objection, that and all of my colleagues, their full statements will be made a part of the record. I'd like to now yield to Mr. Cicinelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding today's hearing, and thank you also to our ranking member, Congresswoman Bass, for convening this important hearing, and thank you to our witnesses. Fostering religious understanding and combating anti-Semitism is a critical and very important challenge. In the United States, the work we do internationally to protect the human rights of people of every faith is a reflection of our nation's values and founding principles. We are all, of course, familiar with the historical consequences of anti-Semitism, especially when it is infused with a political dimension. The purpose of this hearing is absolutely essential. It's very important to discuss the impact anti-Semitism has on global understanding and the rights of all people. And so I want to just welcome the witnesses who are here today, to thank you for participating in this hearing on this very important topic. I look forward to hearing your diverse and global perspectives. I think we all recognize that the rise of anti-Semitism is deeply troubling, and considering what actions we can take to respond to this phenomenon, what public policies we can implement, what educational policies we can promote to help to eradicate anti-Semitism all over the world should be our focus. And I thank you to the extent you are going to contribute to that discussion, and I welcome you to the hearing today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, my friend. I'd like to yield to Mr. Marino, former U.S. Attorney from Pennsylvania and member of this committee.
I yield back. I have no opening statement.
Mr. Burr.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing. As we're going to hear, anti-Semitism and hate crimes continue to plague our nation and the world. In 2011, over 1,080 cases were reported nationwide. Unfortunately, my community in Sacramento knows firsthand the dangers of this form of hatred. This weekend, I had the privilege of visiting Congregation Beth Shalom, a synagogue in Carmichael, California, for Purim celebrations. There, I witnessed a vibrant and joyful community celebrating their faith. However, just 14 years ago, this community was victimized by anti-Semitic arsonists who burned 3 synagogues. Congregation Beth Shalom, as well as those of B'nai Israel and Knesset Israel Torah Center, were victims of these senseless attacks. Our community is all too aware of the threat that anti-Semitism poses to freedom in this country and around the world. These attacks in 1999 came as a shock. They served as a cruel reminder that the desire to erase the Jewish people and their culture persists. At B'nai Israel, a community founded in 1849 and the oldest congregational-owned synagogue west of the Mississippi River, more than 5,000 books were destroyed. Ancient, irreplaceable Judaica were lost in the fire, and a community of believers peacefully practicing their faith were deeply shaken. An intern in my office attends Beth Shalom, the congregation that I visited this weekend. She was only 6 years old at the time of the attacks. Her parents struggled to explain why anyone would do something so awful to the good people they knew, friends, family, neighbors. Just days after the arson, a unity rally was held at the Sacramento Community Center. More than 5,000 people of all faiths came to support the synagogues. The congregation received hundreds of cards, donations, and a community pulling together. Signs read, "United We Stand," could be seen in windows throughout Sacramento. As we know in Sacramento firsthand, battling anti-Semitism is going to be an ongoing struggle. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for convening this important hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for telling us how we are going to continue this battle. I yield back
Thank
my
you very
time.
much. I'd like to now yield to Mr. Meadows.
I just want to thank each one of you for being here on this critical issue as we address it, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. As we look at this, one of the things that I hope each one of you can address is how so many times we publicly say that this is something that we can't stand, but yet quietly we tolerate it. And so what we need to do is make sure that not only our rhetoric is matched by our actions, but what we need to do, not only as a nation, but as a leader in the world, to highlight this particular issue. The other part of that is there's been much emphasis played on the economic role and how that exacerbates this problem. And while history shows that there certainly is an economic component to it, as we see the nation of Israel, we've got a 10,000 square mile nation that has no oil, no gold, no iron, and yet it's surrounded by 5.2 million square miles of oil-rich country, and they are seen as the aggressor, which is not actually the case. And so even though there may be an economic component to it, what I would love to see from each one of you and would welcome hearing is how that we can address this and highlight the atrocities that are happening over and over, and what's the causal effect of that, and how as an international body perhaps that we can put influence or pressure to bear to highlight this so that it doesn't continue to be tolerated in our world. Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Weber?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the meeting, and I echo the same sentiments and remarks. I will be committed to eliminating anti-Semitism around the world. The United States stood tall once before, and I look forward to being part of standing tall once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Weber, very much. It is now a privilege to introduce our first panel. But before I do that, I do want to acknowledge the presence of Annette Lantos, the wife, and very distinguished in her own right, but the wife of our former chairman, Tom Lantos, who we all deeply miss. And our first witness will be Katrina Lantos Sweat, who is Tom's daughter and Annette's daughter. Dr. Katrina Lantos Sweat is the chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, an independent U.S. government commission that monitors the universal right to freedom of religion, of belief abroad. She established the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice in 2008 and serves as its president and chief executive officer, carrying on the unique and tremendous legacy of her father, the late Congressman Tom Lantos. We will then hear from Eric Metaxas, who is the author of the best-selling books, including Bonhoeffer and Amazing Grace, William Wilberforce, who was a personal hero of mine, and the heroic campaign to end slavery, and more than 30 other books. A very, very prolific and effective writer. He is currently the voice of Breakpoint, a radio commentary. He was a keynote speaker at the 2012 National Prayer Breakfast and was awarded the Canterbury Medal in 2011 by the Beckett Fund for Religious Freedom. We then hear from Zuhdi Jasser, who is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy and is the author of The Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. Dr. Jasser is a first-generation American Muslim whose parents fled the oppressive Ba'ath regime in Syria. He earned his medical degree on a U.S. Navy scholarship and served 11 years in the U.S. Navy. Dr. Jasser currently serves on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. We'll then hear from John Garvey, who is the president of the Catholic University of America. Mr. Garvey is the dean of Boston College Law School, was the dean, and the president of the Association of American Law Schools. He has practiced law and taught at Notre Dame, Michigan, and Kentucky. He is the author or co-author of numerous books, including Religion and the Constitution, which won the Alpha Sigma Nu Jesuit Book Award and won the Catholic Press Association Award for another work that he authored as well. Then we will hear from Elisa Massimino, who has been the President and Chief Executive Officer of Human Rights First, and no stranger to this subcommittee. She helped establish the Washington office in 1991 and served as the organization's Washington director from 1997 to 2008. She has served as pro bono counsel in many human rights cases, testified before this committee and others more than a dozen times, and is published frequently. The Hill has repeatedly named her as one of the top 20 public advocates in the country. Very distinguished list, and without objection, your full resumes will be made a part of the record, but I'd like to now ask Dr. Sweat if she would proceed.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be here today. It's a great honor to appear with this distinguished panel of witnesses. And of course, Mr. Chairman, we all know that you are among the most valiant and courageous defenders of human rights in all their forms and for all people everywhere that our country has known. And so it's a particular pleasure for me to be here testifying before you. And lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge my father there gazing down upon me, certainly my personal hero and someone who, as the only survivor of the Holocaust ever to serve in this body, his presence is with us here today, and I know he is incredibly grateful to know that these hearings are taking place. I'd like to ask Mr. Chairman that the full text of my remarks be entered in the record, because in the interest of time, I probably won't be able to deliver every word as written.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you so much. In light of today's hearing, it is fitting to note that just a few days ago, last Sunday, Jews around the world celebrated the annual festival of Purim. As related in the biblical book of Esther, Purim is the story of how the Jews of the Persian Empire, nearly 25 centuries ago, faced the danger of imminent extermination at the hands of Haman, the king's prime minister. This ancient threat represents the first known plot to entirely destroy the Jewish people. Through a dramatic turn of events, and may I say through the courage and cleverness of beautiful Esther, the plot was thwarted and the Jewish people were delivered from destruction. It is ironic indeed that in today's Persia, which we now call Iran, its current leaders follow in Haman's footsteps by expressing their own form of vicious anti-Semitism and their avowed determination to wipe Israel, the Jewish homeland, off the map. Top officials have denied the reality of the Nazi Holocaust, the most serious effort in history to obliterate the Jewish people. As the daughter of Holocaust survivors, I can testify as to how surreal it is for a people to have to defend themselves in this day and age, not only against hateful attitudes and behaviors, but also against those who try to dissuade others from believing that 6 million people were killed for the sole crime of being Jews. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism remains a phenomenon that knows no national boundaries. I was recently confronted with the reality of this during an official USER visit to Egypt. One of the most dramatic moments of that visit to Egypt was when I sat across at a very close distance from a high official in the Morsi government and personally confronted him on some of President Morsi's recently unearthed statements in which he says that we must nurse our children and grandchildren on hatred of the Jews down to the last generation, and in which he referred to Jews as the descendants of apes and pigs. I said to that minister, your president was calling on hatred of me down to the last generation. Your president was saying that I and my 7 children are the descendants of apes and pigs. This is not the conduct of a civilized people. These are not the words of a civilized man. This is a stain upon the honor of Egypt, a stain upon the character of your nation, and it must stop. I share that experience because I think in some senses it holds the key to the answer that we're all seeking today. How do we confront anti-Semitism? It's awkward, it's uncomfortable, it's personal, it's direct, it's tense. We don't shrug our shoulders. We don't, to borrow a phrase from President Bush, sort of indulge in the bigotry, soft bigotry of low expectations and say, well, it's the Muslim world. We'll shrug our shoulders and kind of just move on and get to the more serious discussions. We face it. We confront it. These you know, we know that, I'm sorry, I'm going to return to my written remarks here. Anti-Semitism remains a phenomenon that, as I say, knows no national boundaries. Through vigilance and wakefulness, we have tried to confront it in every corner and in every country and in every region of the world. And in Europe, the enormity of the Holocaust compelled Europe's peoples to begin the critical task of self-examination, confronting hateful actions stemming from poisonous attitudes and beliefs which permeated Europe for nearly 17 centuries, helping to demonize a people and preparing the way for the unthinkable. This painful realization of how homegrown hatred sowed the seeds for genocide remains a significant force in Europe today. Yet now, nearly 70 years after the Holocaust, the fact remains that across Europe, from east to west, anti-Semitism lives and is gaining momentum. You know, I know that time is short and I don't want to overstep my time, so instead of detailing, as I think some of my fellow witnesses will, the incredibly broad scope of examples of anti-Semitism across Europe, I'd like to speak briefly about the perpetrators and the enablers of these very disturbing acts. The perpetrators of these acts across Europe and elsewhere largely are individuals or members of groups who are deeply hostile to democracy and pluralism. Some are neo-Nazis who express their admiration for Adolf Hitler. Others are racist skinhead groups active in many countries. And many are violent religious extremists who distort the religion of Islam to suit their own intolerant political aims. Compounding this problem are four critical factors. First, while the number of Europeans participating in anti-Semitic acts is minuscule, nearly every recent survey on anti-Semitism in Europe shows that negative attitudes towards Jews among Europe's population remain surprisingly widespread. Second, these surveys show that to an alarming degree, at least some of this bias against Jews masquerades, as you said, Mr. Chairman, as criticism of the State of Israel. While we all know that no country is beyond reproach for its particular policies, when criticism takes the form of language that seeks to delegitimize, demonize, and apply a double standard to that nation, then we have to insist on calling it what it is, anti-Semitism. We must unmask it. I am reminded of how persistent this problem has been. Back in 1968, the non-Jewish writer Erich Hoffer put it well when he wrote, and I quote, "Other nations, when they are victorious, dictate peace terms, but when Israel is victorious, it must sue for peace." He added, "Everyone expects the Jews to be the only Christians in this world." Very penetrating comment, I think. A third factor, European governments initially were slow to respond to the threat posed to Jews, and even now, according to a number of Jewish community leaders and public officials, often at the local level, leadership remains reluctant to identify publicly the ideological or religious identity or motivation of some of the perpetrators of anti-Semitic acts. And this lackadaisical attitude has contributed to a climate of complacency vis-a-vis this issue. Finally, as USERF has documented and articulated, a number of European governments, along with certain political parties, are complicating matters by supporting initiatives that single out certain Jewish religious practices for restriction. In at least 4 countries, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland, kosher slaughter is flatly banned. Authorities and political forces in Norway and Germany have also tried to ban infant male circumcision. To be sure, the driving force behind such restrictions, which also affect Muslims, is not primarily anti-Semitism per se. It is more directly related to a tendency in some Western European countries to replace monolithic state religions with monolithic secular ideologies. And we see that this aggressive secularism in some instances targets traditional Christianity and Islam as well. In both instances, past and present, Judaism and other minority belief systems are left on the outside. Nonetheless, this drive to ban kosher slaughter and circumcision evokes tragic images of much darker days for Jews in Europe. At the very least, such efforts reveal a chilling indifference to the Jewish historical experience in Europe. The end result is that the atmosphere throughout Europe today is one in which Jewish communities feel insecure and threatened, and the general population seems dangerously complacent, and even comfortable with widespread open manifestations of anti-Semitism. I know we're going to have the opportunity to discuss solutions and answers in our later discussions. So let me close, if I may, with one more paraphrase from Eric Hoffer, this former longshoreman and social philosopher. He wrote, and I'm paraphrasing him here a bit, "I have a premonition that will not leave me. As it goes with the Jews, so will it go with all of us. Should the Jews perish, the Holocaust will be upon us all." Thank you very much.
Dr. Lantos-Sweat, thank you for that very powerful statement. Now I'll ask Mr. Metaxas if he would proceed.
First of all, let me thank you all for the invitation to be here this morning. I grew up in America, but my parents are immigrants from war-torn Europe, from Greece and Germany, respectively. They inculcated in me a great pride in their adopted country, so to testify here is for me a high privilege indeed. This morning I testify as an American and as a Christian. What it is to be an American and what it is to be a Christian can be tremendously misunderstood. So let me be clear here as I set out in stating that I believe that in the true sense, both of these identities, American and Christian, are identities that are not tribalistic, but that bring with them a sense of obligation for others and a perspective that is by definition focused on others. For example, to be an American is not to be part of any ethnic group, but to be part of something that transcends ethnicity. To be an American is to buy into an idea that pluralism is good and that a multiplicity of peoples and ideologies and races and religions can coexist. This is at the heart of the American experiment. And to be an American is to buy into the idea that not only can they coexist, but that in coexisting civilly, they will add up to a sum far greater than their parts. To be a Christian is likewise to know that one is not part of an ethnic group, but of a group that transcends and potentially includes all ethnic groups. So true Americans and true Christians can never be tribalists or racists. If we ever put one group above another group, we're denying ourselves and the core beliefs that make us Americans or Christians. I've written a biography of the great German pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who spoke up for the Jews when very few Germans were doing so. And we have to ask, why did he do that? Why did he risk his life, for example, to get 7 Jews out of Germany and into neutral Switzerland so that their lives might be saved? Bonhoeffer stood up for the Jews for one reason, because he was a Christian. Not a mere churchgoer, not a mere Gentile, but a Christian. Bonhoeffer famously once said that only he who speaks out for the Jews can sing Gregorian chants. In other words, anyone who claims to be a Christian and does not do whatever he can to help the persecuted Jews has no right to claim to be a Christian. That person is only a hypocrite and a betrayer of the Christian faith. But why? Is this merely an assertion by me and by Bonhoeffer? Well, no, because at the heart of the Christian faith is this idea that God blesses us so that we might bless others. He gives us whatever he gives us for others. Indeed, it's in Genesis that God states this in the context of making the first Jew, Abraham. He says he will bless Abraham so that Abraham can bless others. He will bless the Jews, and he chooses the Jews. The Christian believes that God chose the Jews as his own people so that out of them he might bring himself to the whole world beyond the Jews, that he might, out of the Jewish people, raise up his Messiah. And so the Jews are blessed to be a blessing, chosen out of all groups in the world to bless the whole world. The Bible also says every human being is made in God's image, and God loves us equally. So to serve God, we must serve others. In fact, Bonhoeffer says that Jesus Christ is the man for others. The self-giving agape love of Jesus is the love that gives at the expense of oneself, knowing that whatever we do to bless others, God will replenish. So to be a Christian is to love and serve others, specifically others different from us. When Hitler began persecuting Jews in earnest in 1933, Bonhoeffer wrote an essay titled "The Church and the Jewish Question," declaring that it was the duty of German Christians to stand up for the Jews, indeed for any group being persecuted. But this is an American belief too, although I dare say you can guess where we got it from. America is not a democracy, but a republic. Majorities do not decide what is true. In America, minorities are protected when necessary because we believe what the Bible teaches, that some truths are transcendent and not subject to plebiscite. And one of those ideas is the dignity of every human being despite his beliefs or racial or ethnic makeup. We are inherently sacred because we are made in God's image. So God commands every Christian to stand up for those being treated unjustly or persecuted in any way. And in America, we have enshrined that into our very laws. So today, as a Christian and as an American, I declare that anyone who sees things from a tribalist or racist perspective, and anti-Semitism is one especially prominent expression of this, then that person declares himself not to understand the Christian faith and not to be a Christian. The true Christian knows that his enemy is not the Jew, but his enemy is the enemy of the Jew. One final point. Throughout history, Gentiles, which is to say those who are not Jewish, have often been confused with Christians. Often they have themselves encouraged and participated in this confusion. But a mere Gentile is no Christian. All dedicated Nazis were Gentiles. None were Christians. To be a Christian is to know that you have, according to the New Testament, been grafted in to the Jewish faith. Your Messiah and your God, Jesus, is a Jew, and all of his disciples are Jews. On Kristallnacht in 1938, Bonhoeffer for the first time made the very dramatic leap into seeing an attack on Jews as an attack on God himself. So Christians who think of themselves as some tribal group in opposition to Jews are profoundly deluded. To demonize any group based on what they believe or their ethnic makeup is to admit that one's own beliefs are not in the God of the Bible, but in a counterfeit God who is in fact the ancient enemy of that God. Not to stand up to attacks against any group, especially Jews, is to deny the transcendent truths that we are all created in God's image with certain inalienable rights. Bonhoeffer said that silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. So to do nothing when anti-Semitism raises its head is to hasten the death of civil society for everyone. Everyone who has the privilege to call himself a Christian or an American must stand against these things and not just stand against them, but take action against them. We must recall the words of Bonhoeffer's friend Martin Niemöller, who wrote his famous poem, "First they came for the communists and I didn't speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. And then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me." Niemöller himself did not speak up until it was too late, and his poem cautions us to speak out when any group is being persecuted. This is the right thing and the American thing and the Christian thing to do. God commands it. Thank you.
Thank you for that very powerful statement as well, and for providing us a refresher course on the model of Bonhoeffer, which we all need to emulate. Thank you so very much. Dr. Jasser.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Bass, distinguished members of the committee, for seeking my testimony. I must first thank the committee for taking the time to focus on this very important issue of anti-Semitism and its important role as a canary in the coal mine, if you will, for the threat against all people, all faiths, and liberty. Our organization, the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, is dedicated as a Muslim organization in the mission to the advancement of liberty through the separation of mosque and state. My comments are abridged, and I submit the full comments to the record. Anti-Semitism is not just another symptom from a radical fringe of Islamist groups. It runs much deeper. This body has been fearless in exposing anti-Semitism in Europe and the West. It is time to do the same with the role in which Islamism, or political Islam, plays upon anti-Semitism around the world, as it also impacts the West. Islamists have utilized the viral spread of anti-Semitic imagery and demonization of Jews as a tool among Muslim-majority communities and nations against the common enemy they fabricate. Beneath Islamist hatred of Jews lies a more global supremacism that treats all minorities, whether Shia, Ahmadiyya, Ismailis, or dissenting Sunnis like myself, from within the faith, and other minorities outside, the same, simply as tools to be inhumanly exploited. Anti-Semitism runs rampant on the fertile soil of Islamism. What is our challenge before us here today? We can help the non-Islamist reformers change that soil, or we can sit back and watch the Islamists in Egypt, the Brotherhood, in Tunisia, al-Nahda, in Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabis, in Iran, the Khomeinists, or Pakistan, the Deobandis, fertilize and till the hate-filled soil into a greater threat. Make no mistake, the departure of Arab fascist dictators in the Arab awakening was a necessary step forward in a long journey toward democracy, and there's still many more of them to go. But societies with rampant anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories, and hate of Western democracies cannot succeed and will always fail. Already, the Muslim Brotherhood, now in power, is buckling down on free speech and blasphemy worse than they were under Mubarak. But please understand that while Islamism is popular, upwards of 30 to 40% at times, it is not a majority movement. But what I'm sure you know is that the hate of anti-Semitism is sadly more popular and is a majority sentiment. Islamists invoke common cause with secularists and the hatred of Jews and the West, and are able to dodge national introspection and build shallow coalitions on that hate. Let's look at the numbers. Pew poll in 2006 stated that the anti-Jewish sentiment is endemic in the Muslim world. In Lebanon, all Muslims and 99% of Christians say they have an unfavorable view of Jews. 99% of Jordanians, large majorities of Moroccans, Indonesians, Pakistanis, and 6 in 10 Turks also view Jews unfavorably. Egyptian TV has long aired the hateful forgery of the protocols, and Al Jazeera, the most watched Muslim media in the world, has countless sermons and programs vilifying Jews in Israel. And Al Jazeera Media Group just recently purchased for $500 million access into American living rooms. With vast global connections in Arabic and social traditional media, Muslim populations in Europe and the United States are impacted by Islamist propaganda. The Pew showed in 2006 that Muslims in Europe hold a far more unfavorable opinions of Jews than the general population. In Britain, 47% of Muslims held unfavorable views compared to 7% of the general public. In France, 28% of Muslims versus 13% of the general public. In Germany, 44% of Muslims versus 22% of the general public. We've been absent in the defense of liberty in these populations that haunts us over there and right here in the West. As hate leads, population shifts will follow. From nearly 1 million Jews in the Arab region around 1950, there are only 20,000 left. Over 2 million Christians have recently left the Middle East. Anti-Semitism is obviously the gateway drug that takes societies away from diverse liberal democracies and moves them closer to homogenous, oppressive autocracies which abuse minorities. If we sit here and tolerate any less for Muslim communities than we do for ourselves in respect to anti-Semitism and the principles embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we're participating not only in a form of denial, but I believe in subtle bigotry. The reality is that Muslim imams, scholars, and activists with the courage to publicly take on anti-Semitism of the Islamists are far too few. They have neither the platforms, the attention, nor the backing which petro-funded Islamist think tanks and linked movements do around the world. Last January, an Arabic and al-Qaeda jihadi forum attacked me as an enemy of Islam, and actually in its attack says that I'm part of the devil that's known for his Zionism. This is all too common, and it's how they marginalize their antagonists and avoid substantive debate. Use anti-Semitism to attack other Muslims. Sheikh Qaradawi, who's known throughout the world as one of the preeminent Sunni leaders, globally in his program on Al Jazeera to over 60 million followers, said the last punishment was carried out by Hitler. This was the divine punishment for them, in reference to the Jews. Allah willing, the next time will be at the hand of the believers. Qaradawi returned to Egypt as Khomeini returned to Iran after the Egyptian Revolution. Lastly, the Saudis spend tens of billions of dollars throughout the world to pump Wahhabism or petro-Islam, a particularly virulent and militant version of supremacist Islamism. An endless list of terror groups use their ideology from al-Qaeda, Hamas, Lashkar-Taiba, to many in their madrasas and mosques that are influenced by Wahhabi materials. A 9th grade Saudi textbook described Jews as the apes or people of the Sabbath, or Jews, and the swine are infidels of the communion of Jesus and Christians. And remember, even if they do remove parts of the textbooks with this, you cannot reform by deletion or whiteout. It needs deep self-critique, and wholesale abandonment of Islamism for liberty. I leave you last with solutions to consider. Number one, we must engage and take sides in the battle of ideas against Islamism by reviving our public diplomacy in support of universal human rights, whether it's popular in their societies or not. We need to systematically expose, name and shame the anti-Semitic behaviors and ideas promulgated by Islamist movements, including all forms of hatred against Jews, conspiracies, and anti-Americanism. Anti-Semitic ideas are not isolated incidents to be simply condemned and dismissed. We should expose their root cause, foremost of which among Muslims is Islamism. And we must work to provide platforms for courageous, reform-based civil society organizations which work against anti-Islamism. And this is what I talk about in my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam. And we must conversely disengage proudly from Islamist groups. We must end the climate of political correctness and subtle bigotry which gives Muslims a pass on accountability for hate-filled ideas. We must not be seen as advocating liberty only at home and turning a blind eye to anti-Semitism from our so-called allies. And we must confront Islamist groups and leaders in Europe with what Prime Minister David Cameron called muscular liberalism. And as my colleagues have already stated, hyper-secularists in Europe attack the faithful of all faiths. Islamists thrive under the deception that Muslims have no other option than to lean towards Islamism. Thank you.
Dr. Jasser, thank you very much for that very important contribution and for reminding this committee, and I think the country, and I hope the press and everyone else, in the way you not only presented your testimony, I do hope everybody will read your entire testimony, that Muslims are speaking out. You are one of the most bravest doing so, but speaking out in a way that really defends all people, Jews, Christians, Muslims themselves, but do so in a way that really calls us to action, and the executive as well as the congressional branch. Thank you so much, Dr. Jasser.
Thank you.
Mr. Garvey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Anti-Semitism is so obviously wrong that I feel almost sheepish making arguments against it, but here we are. So I want to elaborate on 3 points which I hope you will not find unnecessarily self-evident. First, anti-Semitism is intrinsically wrong. It violates human dignity because it denies the right to religious freedom. The Catholic Church calls this our first, most cherished liberty. James Madison argued that the right is unalienable because what is here a right towards men is a duty towards our Creator. The Catholic Church actively seeks its protection regardless of the faith in question. This is why the American bishops lent their strong support to the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998. Anti-Semitism also violates human dignity by denying the right of equality. Here is what the Second Vatican Council said: "The Church reproves, as foreign to the mind of Christ, any discrimination against men or harassment of them because of their race, color, condition of life, or religion." Allow me to add further refinement. The Catholic Church is especially concerned about anti-Semitism because we are one family in the Abrahamic tradition. Catholics call fellow Christians their brothers and sisters in faith. Pope Benedict describes the Jews as our fathers in faith. We share with them the Hebrew Scriptures, and our traditions of prayer are rooted in that book. Together we worship the God of Abraham. Anti-Semitism is an attack on our family. This familial outlook has led our last 2 popes to make powerful gestures of solidarity with the Jewish people. Pope John Paul used a powerful image to condemn the legacy of anti-Semitism when he said during his historic homily at Brzezinka that the concentration camp is the Golgotha of the modern world. Second, anti-Semitism is not just wrong for Jews, it puts other faiths at risk. This is so, first of all, because the arguments that support anti-Semitism may be deployed with equal force against other faiths. The descriptions used to disparage Jewish communities 100 years ago, that they were clannish, insular, didn't fit in, brought their outsider status on themselves, may be used against Muslims in France today. Their offense, it will be said, is not that they are Muslims. It is that they speak a foreign tongue, dress in inappropriate ways, dispute the principle of laïcité, favor the prospering of foreign states over France. The patterns of violence that have historically characterized anti-Semitism are unfortunately familiar to Christians today. Anti-Christian sentiment in some parts of the world, like anti-Semitism, is rooted in a dislike of religious belief. It manifests itself in similar ways. Pope Benedict described it in an address to the diplomatic corps last year. In many countries, Christians are deprived of fundamental rights. In other countries, they endure violent attacks against their churches and their homes. At times, they're forced to leave the countries they've helped to build because of persistent tensions and policies which frequently relegate them to being second-class spectators of national life. Here's a second cause of harm to other faiths. Anti-Semitism can make the world a more hostile place for other religions through a strategy of divide and conquer. Anti-Semitism does not attack belief itself. It focuses its attention on a particular group of believers. When they're intimidated into silence, the strength of the cohort of believers is reduced to that degree. Here again is how James Madison saw the danger. It is proper, he said, to take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties. Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion of all other sects? Third, like other cancers, anti-Semitism spreads its poison to all parts of the body politic. A society that tolerates anti-Semitism cannot maintain a healthy democracy. First, as a matter of historical fact, the Western commitment to political liberty grew out of our acceptance of religious toleration. John Neville Figgis, the student of Lord Acton, famously said that political liberty is the residuary legatee of ecclesiastical animosities. Our success in living with religious differences gave us a lesson in tolerating political differences and a hope that we could surmount them. If we're passive in the face of anti-Semitism, we risk running our constitutional evolution in reverse. Second, as the late Ronald Dworkin was fond of pointing out, democracy rests on a commitment to equality. Anti-Semitism, like racism, denies this. We saw this in our own treatment of African Americans. The original Constitution treated slaves as less than fully human. Dred Scott held that slaves were not citizens. A society that tolerates anti-Semitism behaves in a similar way and is not worthy to be recognized as a democracy. Third, such a society can make no claim to be a liberal democracy. The defining characteristic of a liberal democracy is its commitment to liberty. Our own Supreme Court has held that the fundamental concept of liberty comprises an absolute freedom to adhere to such religious organization or form of worship as the individual may choose. To persecute a people for their religious belief and form of worship is to deny the most fundamental commitment of a liberal democracy. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to offer a few thoughts on an issue of such concern to us.
Corey, thank you very much for your testimony. You profoundly state how anti-Semitism is intrinsically wrong, and as a Catholic, your point that anti-Semitism is an attack on our family as well certainly rings true, and I think that and believe that goes for all faiths. But thank you for your extraordinary testimony. Ms. Massimino.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to share Human Rights First findings and recommendations on this important issue and to discuss how to further our common goal of combating intolerance and advancing human rights. We are deeply grateful to you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership and to this subcommittee for its important role in keeping human rights front and center in the Congress. Anti-Semitism is not a Jewish issue. And it's not a religious issue. It's a human rights issue, and we all have to confront it. The failure of governments to punish those who commit violence, targeting Jews and Jewish communities, and to condemn and counteract virulent anti-Semitic hate speech creates an environment that endangers not only Jews, but the rights and security of adherents of other religious faiths and members of other minority groups. A healthy civil society cannot flourish in the face of unchecked hatred. Indeed, we see time and again that hate does not exist in neat compartments, but it metastasizes, creating an enabling environment for violence that affects immigrants, members of religious and sexual minorities, Roma, and many, many others. For more than a decade, Human Rights First has been working to monitor and combat anti-Semitic violence and to press for stronger government action. Although anti-Semitism is a global problem, my testimony today will focus on anti-Semitic violence in Europe and the former Soviet Union, where the translation of sentiment against Israel or the policy of its government into anti-Jewish antipathy has generated new and unique anti-Semitic violence that has fluctuated in relation to events in the Middle East. At the same time, age-old manifestations of anti-Semitism persist and are often deeply intertwined with the prejudices that fuel hatred against other minorities. Anti-Semitism remains at the core of organized racial supremacist groups in Western Europe and of broad nationalist movements in Eastern and Central Europe that target immigrants, Roma, LGBT persons, and religious minorities, among others. It is thus important that individuals and leaders from faith and other communities come together to condemn anti-Semitism and other forms of intolerance, and this hearing is an important opportunity for us to reflect on the interrelationship of these threats and the importance of solidarity in confronting them. Anti-Semitic violence, as well as other forms of hate crime, should not be seen simply as the problems of individual victims or their communities. They must be seen and responded to for what they are, serious violations of human rights. These threats of fundamental rights must be challenged not just by the victims or communities of targeted individuals, but by all those who seek to advance universal rights and freedoms. I'd like to make 4 key points today. First, anti-Semitism is a unique and potent form of racism and religious intolerance, and the extent of violence motivated by anti-Jewish animus throughout the OSCE region remains at disturbingly high levels. Second, with few notable exceptions, government responses to this rising tide of violence have been wholly inadequate. Third, the failure to confront anti-Semitic hatred corrodes the rights and security of all people. Along with anti-Semitic violence, the targeting of individuals because of their race, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, or other factors has been on the rise in recent years in many countries across the globe. Strategies for combating anti-Semitic violence through a human rights framework are effective, and they are necessary for stemming the tide of hate-fueled violence against others as well. And finally, U.S. leadership is essential in confronting anti-Semitism. My written testimony concludes with recommendations for strengthening U.S. leadership in this area. The level of anti-Semitic violence in Europe and North America today is disturbingly high. Synagogues, Jewish homes, and Jewish-owned businesses have been targeted in arson attacks and subjected to widespread vandalism, and students and teachers in Jewish schools and ordinary people have been harassed, beaten, stabbed, or shot simply because they were Jewish. Anti-Semitism is devastating not only to individual victims, but it terrorizes entire communities, making participation in public life fully and free from fear impossible. In one of the most horrifying such incidents last March, a 23-year-old man of Algerian descent carried out a series of terrorist attacks targeting Jewish civilians and French soldiers. In total, 7 people were killed, including a rabbi and his 2 young children. Violent crime is anti-Semitism's sharp edge, but it often occurs in the context of virulent hate speech. In some countries, political and religious leaders are the ones spewing this hate, attacking Jews through stereotypes and scapegoating. In addition, Jews as people are often vilified in the context of attacks on Israel. While criticism of Israeli government policies, or the policies of any government, is legitimate discourse, it crosses the line when it disparages or demonizes Jews as a people. When hate speech involves direct and immediate threats of violence, governments must hold perpetrators criminally accountable, but it's important that we approach this challenge in a thoughtful way. Confronting hate speech must not impinge on free expression. There are ample cases, as you know, Mr. Chairman, particularly in countries like Russia, where the rule of law is weak, in which hate speech statutes are misused to prosecute dissenting voices and civil society activists, even those who are speaking out against hatred and working to advance tolerance. Instead, hate speech must be countered by clear public statements from a cross-section of political and civil society leaders to condemn prejudice and hatred and to affirm the dignity and rights of all. Consistent condemnation of hate speech is still sorely lacking across Europe and in many other parts of the world. It is vital that political leaders speak out promptly and unequivocally to condemn hate speech. Similarly, it's crucial that the voices condemning hate speech are raised not only from those in targeted communities. Creating a multifaceted chorus of counter-speech is a key to marginalizing the voices of anti-Semitism and diminishing the impact on the targeted community. The United States has a long history of this approach in lieu of hate speech laws to address hateful views in political discourse. U.S. embassy officials should speak more frequently in this way and urge influential political leaders in the countries in question to do the same. When political leaders from across party lines condemn anti-Semitism and other forms of intolerance, it sends an important message to the victim communities and to others who would speak so. I want to summarize my recommendations quickly. The full text of them are in my written testimony. First, in order to strengthen U.S. leadership in this area, the U.S. should elevate the importance of religious freedom in its U.S. foreign policy by developing a national security strategy that promotes international religious freedom, combats anti-Semitic and related violence, and confronts hate speech while protecting free expression. Second, the U.S. should establish an interagency mechanism to deploy strategically the resources and programs from across the U.S. government to combat hate crime globally. Third, making combating anti-Semitism an important component of bilateral engagement through an interagency effort. That means not just the State Department, but every agency of the U.S. government needs to raise this in its bilateral relations with other countries. Fourth, maintaining the international leadership of the United States in multilateral forums like the OSCE is critically important, and thanks to your leadership, Mr. Chairman, we are doing just that. In conclusion, the failure to confront anti-Semitic hatred corrodes the rights and security of all people. And that's why this hearing, framed as you framed it, is so important. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership and your persistence in seeking to eradicate anti-Semitism.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Massimino. Let me just begin the questioning and then yield to my distinguished colleagues. Dr. Jasser, you talked about this tendency to give Muslims a pass. There are a number of Muslim leaders, as you and I know so well, Ray Suric from the former Grand Mufti of Bosnia, who has spoken out repeatedly, as have others. But I find, and you may find this as well, they get almost no traction in the popular media and absolutely no coverage in the Middle East. You pointed out the role that how did you put it? Anti-Semitism was long a tool utilized by Islamists in order to invoke common sympathy from secular nationalists who also developed a hatred of Jews in order to avoid national introspection. To what extent is that understood in the Muslim world? And if you could speak to the role, and others might want to speak to it as well, that hate TV plays. We had Natan Sharansky testify at one of my hearings years ago, and he brought a clip of a soap opera, so-called, that ran throughout the Middle East that showed a blood libel, a little boy, Christopher, having his throat slit to be put into the matzah, an absolute libel against Jews. And he said, people believe this. And I'm wondering, how can such a lie be embraced by so many people? Where's the corresponding pushback? But if you could speak to that.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I can't tell you how important all of these questions are. I'll start with the last one, which is, hate TV and the media. It is no mistake that these ideas are getting traction. It's because of the billions of dollars put behind it. Al Jazeera has a huge following. Egyptian TV, Iranian press TV, all of these propaganda arms are bolstered with billions of dollars and simply spread a lot of these ideas. And eventually, even though the people may distrust and hate their governments and dictatorships, it's going to gain traction in their mindset because that was all they see. And that's why the Arab awakening has been a good thing in order to begin to have diversity in the media and in the mindsets. And the other thing is that we've been missing in action. As far as promoting ideas and engaging in their media. When we put money into Iraq and the media there that we had, Hurra TV, it doesn't get any ratings. They're not going to watch American TV. What we need to do is give platforms to Muslim organizations, Muslim reformers, as you mentioned, from Bosnia, and we have a coalition of reformers called the American Islamic Leadership Coalition that includes Canadians and American reformers that right now is almost 30 different members of organizations that have been working to expose anti-Semitism, includes people like Tariq Fatah, that has recently written a book on Islam and Islamist anti-Semitism. So I think it's important. These platforms do not come easily. They've had a huge head start because of the funding, and that funding has had a core ideology. The secularists of these dictatorships have, in many ways, co-opted this anti-Semitism as a bridge to build these coalitions. The people really have been taken by it because there's no infrastructure of education, economic well-being, free markets in order to counter this. And until the secularists, who are a majority, I believe, find some unifying idea, they're going to continue to be fractionated, and the Islamists, who are only a plurality, are going to continue to win elections as they have in Egypt and Tunisia until the secularists can come together in a unifying idea such as liberty. In the meantime, they've only been unified by generations of hate. Mubarak, who was supposedly our ally, showed the protocols. Assad in Syria and his father instilled hate. They instill hate in their population, even though they're secular, against faith communities, because it works to monopolize the masses and control their mindset via anti-Semitism as the tool to do that. And I can't tell you enough how much it's important for us to develop public-private partnerships of reform-based organizations. And I think anti-Semitism, work against it, will be a tool to begin to get into taking sides within the House of Islam. As long as we don't take sides, the Islamists are going to win because they're the strong horse.
Let me ask you, Dr. Lantos-Sweat, you, in your testimony, quoted Egyptian President Morsi as urging the teaching of hatred of Jews in the country, to the country's children. Why is it that so many governments, and I would include our own, mistakenly look at the Muslim Brotherhood as somehow being moderate when it has such a profoundly anti-Semitic foundation to it.
Well, I think this relates to an ongoing challenge that those of us who advocate passionately on behalf of human rights face, and that is the ever-present specter of realpolitik. I think that we have historically viewed the Muslim Brotherhood as a very dangerous organization with values and principles and platforms utterly inimical to our American values and democracy. But as my colleague Zuhdi Jasser just said, because the Muslim Brotherhood, specifically in Egypt, was the strong horse after the fall of Mubarak, we found ourselves walking down that road of finding reasons to excuse and explain away very, very disturbing elements of their platform. And I think that's the situation that we find ourselves in. I think it's also, sadly, a reality that Morsi is probably now, relatively speaking, a moderate as against some of the really extreme Salafis who are part of his coalition and are playing a very, very significant role in Egypt today. So I think we are drawn down that road, and history shows again and again and again that human rights, when they are marginalized, when they're put in a neat, tidy little box in the corner, is something that we simply address rhetorically every now and then conveniently kind of stash them in that diplomatic corner labeled irrelevant and unimportant. It comes back to bite us in a very hard way when it comes to the rubber meets the road reality of American politics. My colleague Eleni Massimino down at the end of the table spoke about the need for the United States to develop a national security policy based around the priority and importance of religious freedom. Anybody with eyes to see can understand that many of the gravest threats facing our nation today from a national security and a terrorism, anti-terrorism perspective are coming from societies where religious freedom is constrained, where you don't have robust protections that lead to tolerance, democracy, pluralism, all the virtues that we are here advancing. So it is, it is a very dangerous and short-sighted game to ignore the long-term strength that comes to a society when we base our policies on standing firmly and strongly for our most profound values, because those profound values of pluralism, tolerance, democracy, equality, freedom have built the strong nation that we enjoy today. And it's by pursuing and strengthening those policies abroad that we can build strong allies and strong partners.
The chair's time has expired. Mrs. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for really compelling and powerful testimony. I'm certain that if everyone in the world had the opportunity to just hear the testimony of these 5 witnesses, it would mark significant progress in our efforts to eradicate anti-Semitism. So thank you. And particularly thank you because I think the particular power of non-Jewish voices in this work is significant, and you all represent very important organizations and institutions and religious traditions that I think need to play a very important leadership role in helping to eradicate anti-Semitism all over the world. And I'm struggling to sort of think of what we can do as a Congress. It seems to me that, as President Garvey said, this seems so obvious that it's difficult to imagine we need to have a hearing on it. But I think it's really actually a very valuable exercise, and I thank the chairman for convening this, because I think the more we raise attention to the reality of anti-Semitism, sort of acknowledging that this is a worldwide and serious problem, I think is the first and most important step, and then bringing attention to it and having universal condemnation of it. But I want to just focus for my few minutes on the education component, because it seems to me the condemnation and continuing to be sure that people understand the reality of anti-Semitism by collecting data and tracking it, and all that part is certainly something that everyone should accept as important. But what I want to try to understand is what we might be able to do to help deal with ways to educate the next generation of people in our world about the the dangers of anti-Semitism and how it is not simply a Jewish problem, but a problem for humanity and a problem for human dignity and religious freedom all over the world. We have in my district something called the Holocaust Education and Resource Center of Rhode Island, whose mission it is to reduce prejudice and the injustice of bigotry against all minorities by teaching the current generation about the Holocaust and using the Holocaust as a way to really teach important values of human dignity and religious freedom. And I would like each of the witnesses to sort of comment on what can we do as members of Congress that will most effectively respond to this very serious rise in anti-Semitism all over the world. I mean, as Dr. Lantos Sweat mentioned, and it's a great honor to welcome you to the committee. As a new member of Congress, your father was a huge hero to me and a great inspiration to so many people. But as you mentioned in your testimony, this effort to eradicate the Jews began 25 centuries ago, and unfortunately, of course, was evidenced by very horrific, actionable events throughout history that operationalized that effort to eradicate Jews, from the murder of 6 million Jews to individual instances of anti-Semitism. So I'd just like to ask each of the witnesses to suggest to us something we can do that will help in this really important effort. And again, thank you for your testimonies. Maybe start with Dr. Lantos.
Well, it's a wonderful question, and it's one that I don't have a simple answer to. But I look with some optimism at where we in this country and to some extent globally have come as a society and as a world on many long and persistent evils that beset us. You know, I went with my family this past weekend to Gettysburg. I'd never actually been there before, and it was a really profound experience. I recommend it to anybody who has not gone. But I could not help but be struck by the fact that less than 150 years after that terrible, terrible battle, which was sort of the turning of a war, to try and erase a terrible stain on our nation's history and our character and our claim to be a decent people, that we did as a society and as a country move to the point where the first African American was elected President of the United States. And it is no longer permissible in polite society for that sort of racism to be expressed. I encounter it very rarely. I know it's not eradicated, but it has been to an overwhelming extent eliminated. More recently, you know, I look back on my youth, let alone my childhood, and certain just common, easy expressions of bigotry and really cruelty towards gay and lesbian members of our society. It was okay. It was just kind of considered normative, if you will. I think we're moving to the point where that also is being eliminated. And yet, this strange toxic pathology of anti-Semitism persists and has a sort of a pass. I see of it and hear of it on college campuses. I teach at Tufts University. And I see and hear of it in a variety of venues. And so I don't know why, as we see society generally progressing, this one form of evil gets something of a pass. So it is, you know, I was incredibly moved by Mr. Metaxas's brilliant exposition of how impermissible and insupportable this attitude is from the Christian lens and perspective. But I don't think we have cracked that nut. Certainly Holocaust education is part of it. But at some level, this goes very deep. We have to confront the evil within. What is it within societies that permit this to somehow be given a pass where other prejudices and other forms of racism and intolerance are not?
Mr. Marino.
Thank you, Chairman. This question I think I'm going to direct to Mr. Metaxas. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
No one knows the actual pronunciation, so that's just as good as any.
Okay, so how about if we go with Mr. M? Yeah. That's fine. Thank you, sir. Thank you all for being here. Very specific question. I'd like you to elaborate on it if you could. And if there is time, anyone else who wants to jump in, please do. I had the opportunity to visit Israel last year, spent a couple of sessions, the group meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu and other officials, but equally important, meeting with the citizens of the people of Israel, and actually being there when there were attacks coming from Palestine, hearing the explosions, hearing the sirens go off, and being told that to teach their children in Israel that they have about 15 seconds once they hear that siren go off to get to some location to try and get protection. So how does one negotiate when the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, has said to the Palestinians, I will talk with you anytime, anywhere, let's get started. But the so-called leaders of Israel who of Palestine stand in front of the cameras and make statements such as, we may talk with you once we go back to what we want, which are pre-1967 borders, and at that time, we may stop attacking, we may sit down and negotiate. So what's the alternative there when you have, I'm using this word loosely, leaders in Palestine with that kind of talk and that kind of arrogant attitude?
Well, if you're asking me how to negotiate with recalcitrant Palestinians, I don't know. I will tell you, I think really the issue here, because we talk about realpolitik, we talk about what can we do. For me, it's an issue, and I touched on this in my remarks, of foundational principles. Can we discuss, dare we anymore in the climate in which we live, which is so infected with political correctness, dare we assert the idea that some ideas are right and some ideas are wrong, and on what basis do we do that? In this country, we have not historically been shy about that. We have asserted ideas. The Founding Fathers bequeathed to us this idea of ordered liberty, and I think we are at this point in history as Americans largely ignorant of what that even is, and we have enjoyed its blessings so much that we've become complacent and don't appreciate the fragility of this flower, of what the American experiment in ordered liberty is. I bring this up because I think at the heart of that is religious freedom and freedom of conscience, and if Americans themselves don't understand what this is, what this extraordinarily fragile and infinitely valuable gift is that we have been given, if we cannot articulate what that is, how do we expect the rest of the world to do that? How do we expect the rest of the world to articulate what religious liberty is, what religious freedom is, why someone should be able to say something even though I don't agree with it? If we're not teaching that, and gets back to education, if we're not teaching that in our schools, and for about 40 years, in my memory, we have not been teaching that anymore, because I'm not so sure that we believe it, or that the cultural elites or the people who are in academia are comfortable with it or themselves believe it. So we've allowed ourselves to drift, to take this for granted, and to think somehow that things will be okay. This fragile flower of religious liberty and the ordered freedoms bequeathed to us by the founders requires tending. If it is not tended by Americans, it will die. And I don't see any other place on the surface of the globe where these wonderful ideas are just going to bubble up. Frankly, what bubbles up traditionally is tribalism, violence, sectarian violence. This is normal for what happens on the surface of the globe. So if we in America aren't vigilant about explaining and educating and ourselves understanding what it is that we have, if in fact it is worth having and worth fighting for, if we don't understand it and require our children to understand it, America will evaporate. We are a nation of ideas, and if we don't have a citizenry that appreciates what it is that requires us to respect those with whom we disagree and to fight for those with whom we disagree, if we don't understand that, all is lost. And so I would say to you here, this is at the heart of the problem, that we used to lead the world in this, we used to understand this, we certainly had leaders who understood this. We hardly do anymore, and it will lead to grave problems, and it is now obviously leading to grave problems.
Yeah, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Ranking Member Bass.
Let me take the opportunity to thank the witnesses that are here today and apologize to you to say that one of the things that's so challenging about life here in the Capitol is when you are supposed to be in 3 places at the same time. And so, unfortunately, I'm not able to stay, but I definitely wanted to associate myself with the comments that you were just making when you talk about how vigilant we need to stay in our country, because in so many instances in history, we've moved forward only to go backward. And we have certainly seen a rise of hate in this country like we haven't seen in many years, just in terms of the number of hate groups, you know, that have sprung up, incidences that are happening all over the country. And so the topic today, I think, is very appropriate, and I appreciate you taking the time to come out. The community I represent in Los Angeles has a large Jewish community, and in fact, the Museum of Tolerance is in my district and has definitely been a shining light for the city of Los Angeles in terms of making sure that we always stay vigilant on these issues. I did want to ask a question. The newly created Atrocities Prevention Board, and I wanted to know, as a matter of fact, I was there when the President announced that. I think it was a year ago, or maybe it was even 2. But wanted to know if you would comment on that. And this is directed to anybody on the panel, and how you think that might be leveraged to address anti-Semitism.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. Human Rights First has worked extensively to help create the Atrocities Prevention Board, and we continue to work there to press for a strategy that can address a broad range of tools for atrocities prevention. And of course, a number of us on this panel have talked about the relationship between hate speech and the enabling environment that creates, and the perpetration of violence based on hate. We've seen that in our own society, and we certainly see it across the globe. The Holocaust Museum had an excellent exhibit several years ago on the relationship between anti-Semitic propaganda and the road towards the Holocaust. And I think the United States can play the most constructive role, perhaps, than any other country in the world in navigating what to do about the relationship between hate speech and violence, because we have a strong commitment to free expression, but we also know that hate speech has to be confronted by political leaders. And I wanted to respond to this question of Mr. Cicilline about what Congress can do. And on this issue in particular, I think, through your relationships with your counterparts in other countries, particularly in the countries of the OSCE, but across the globe, I would urge all of you in your individual capacities to call out the lack of counter-speech by political leaders in the face of anti-Semitism. And as well in the context of the OSCE, of which we are a member, and Mr. Chairman has played such a leadership role there. You know, ignorance and hate are a very lethal combination, and education is hugely important. Education of youth, but also we need to understand a problem before we can solve it, and there is a terrible data deficit about anti-Semitic hate violence. There are 21 states now in the OSCE who have committed to producing this data, collecting this data. Only 5 states are reporting on it in all of the OSCE, and we need to be a leader in changing that. Also, I think Congress can be asking Secretary Kerry and the administration more broadly, what is the strategy for combating anti-Semitism? We view this as a national security issue. We think the administration should too. You all created the position of the Special Envoy on Anti-Semitism. You should press to get an appointment there, somebody with the stature and credibility for cross-community outreach who can really help lead that strategy. And also on education, I think it's not enough just to look to the education of our own youth through the Museum of Tolerance or the Holocaust Museum, but we also, and this is something Congress needs to take the lead on, need to look at the role of the Saudis in propagating hate through textbooks. You know, these hearings are important, but it is a drop in a bucket when you think about the young people who are being educated using textbooks that demonize Jews. We are facing a generational problem, and Congress should be inquiring about that. And lastly, I hope you will use the Appropriations Authority to support civil society groups who are working on the front lines in all of these countries to try to combat intolerance and anti-Semitism and hate crime. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Meadows.
Thank each one of you for highlighting this important and critical topic. As we look at it, who will be the next Bonhoeffers? Who will be the next Wilberforces? And I'm looking at a panel that perhaps history will show that because of your efforts, we will see you in that light. I just want to say thank you. As I've jotted down a few notes as we've gone forward in terms of action items, and I think Dr. Jasser, you said name and shame to use your quoted words there as we look at that. And Dr. Sweat, yesterday I know you were talking about the human rights violations that are not just with this particular issue, but against women and children with the Muslim Brotherhood, as in your testimony yesterday. So my question to each one of you, if you could give us 2 action points of what we can do to highlight this and keep it in the forefront of everybody's mind, because what we do is we create organizations, we create titles, we have international organizations that are for human rights, and yet they're hollow in terms of what they actually protect and stand up for. And so identifying those that are real versus not real, I'd love 2 action points from each one of you in my time remaining. Dr. Sweat.
Well, something very specific and timely. I know that President Obama is getting ready to take his first trip to Israel since he became president. Where the context, the platform, the forum in which one speaks out against these evils is often more important than the words that you say, because we could fill up this room from floor to ceiling with brilliant expositions on the evils of anti-Semitism, but in a relatively obscure setting. I think it would be wonderful if all 435 members of the United States Congress were to call the White House in the next few days and say, we would like to have President Obama speak out in the biggest platform that he's going to have on this trip, which will get a lot of attention in Europe and the Middle East about this issue. Context, platform, how big is that pulpit from which these critical things that, as Dr. Garvey said, we all know, it's self-evident, and yet it is not spoken where it's heard. It has become sort of background and wallpaper. So that's kind of a very specific, concrete thing, that in the run-up to this very high-profile visit, which will be under the spotlight, huge pressure on the president to call out the sort of appalling, endemic saturation of anti-Semitism in the Muslim world that Dr. Jasser spoke about so powerfully.
In very clear terms, is what you're saying.
In clear and no moral equivalence. None of this on the one hand and on the other hand.
Okay.
Because the minute we sort of take this evil and kind of put it, again, on the wallpaper. Well, we've got this unfortunate thing, we've got that unfortunate thing, and don't let me forget to mention this third unfortunate thing. You pretty much have robbed it of all of its power and all of its impact. So I think that would be one very concrete thing that I would suggest. And I just want to say, because I know we're getting not far adrift, but one of the things that is so troubling is the resurgence of this evil in Europe.
Right.
And I do hope we'll have a chance to address that, because it's very frightening to see it coming back there.
And maybe some of the rest of you can address that. Dr. Jasser, go ahead.
Yeah, the 2 things I would say is actually one main point is we need to create a national consensus. And I would say, as obvious as anti-Semitism is, don't abandon this issue, because it is the issue that leads us to the conclusion as a nation that Islamism is the problem, is the root cause. That political Islam cannot be put in a wrap and made to look nice. It is a theocratic, theopolitical movement that we need to start looking upon the way we did communism. When Mr. Marino was talking about Israel, Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood. It was an outshoot of it, and that's what you get when the Brotherhood comes to power, is this corrupt...
And is it true that they don't even recognize the existence or Israel's right to exist? Is that correct?
Exactly. And this is what happens when one faith group based on a political movement gets into control. Other countries that have a secular basis, that believe in liberal democracy, will be looked upon as evil and will not be looked upon as their allies. So based on that national consensus, 2 things I would ask you to do. demand that our Secretary of State, our White House disengage from Islamist movements in Europe and America and in the Middle East, and then engage with Muslim movements that are pro-liberty, anti-Islamist, and are looking to build platforms. Those two things, disengage Islamists like the Brotherhood and engage with anti-Islamists.
And if I just want to jump in on one thing, because I think it's a point that needs to be made that pertains very much to what Zuhdi has talked about, and that is that much of the resurgence in Europe is coming from the radical elements of the Muslim community in Europe. So some of the reinfection, if you will, of this hatred and targeting of the Jews does trace its roots to precisely the movements that Dr. Jasser is referring to. So there's a link there. It's not just, you know, the Arab world.
Because the European Muslims are watching Al Jazeera and Middle Eastern media.
I see my time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think, Mr.
But
Barber,
if we've got...
just one quick thing.
Just to,
That'd be great.
I apologize for having to to walk out, but just to say that I do think it is a lack of will and resolve in the West that exists today that did not exist, let's say, 30 years ago, to call things what they are. That, I would say, it's a misunderstanding of what liberty is, a misunderstanding of what freedom of expression is, that would allow people to take advantage, ultimately, of our openness. That is what is clearly happening much more in Europe than it's happening here. We know it's happening in Great Britain. You may be familiar with the work of Baroness Caroline Cox over there. People are loath to see this. Somehow they're looking away from it. If we in America cannot reassert our foundational principles about what is right and what is wrong and stand against those who would bully us, who would take advantage of our openness, which is precisely what is happening, that is allowing these things, then there is nothing to discuss. It really is up to us, and we must decide whether we're willing to do that. Up until now, recently, we have absolutely not been willing to do that.
Can I just add one legal point to follow up on what Mr. Metaxas was saying? The First Amendment, as you know, provides more protection than we might wish for hateful speech. And I want to say two things about that, which we need to keep in mind in these discussions. One is that the fact that the First Amendment protects it does not mean that it's not loathsome and shouldn't be condemned. And second, that we have said since the 1920s, since Justice Holmes, Justice Brandeis first began speaking about this issue, that the remedy for hateful speech is more speech. And that is the one thing that all the members of the panel today and Mr. Meadows seem to have agreed on as something the government should do. The culture that we create by speaking out about anti-Semitism is, in some ways, the most important step that we need to take.
Could I just add one thing to that? You asked for a couple of action items from each of us, and I would say, reiterating this point, that something all of you can do. We cannot let any instance of anti-Semitic hate speech go unchallenged, and that's a big job, sadly, but we all have to take that up. We have to create a climate of intolerance for intolerance, and we need to call on members of civil society who fall down on that front, political leaders who fall down on that front. And then on the deterrence side, we have to empower law enforcement where there is hate violence. You know, we do a good job in this country, thanks to the Matthew Shepard Act and other to prosecute hate crime. Other countries are not as well developed, and we can help them through our law enforcement training and funding.
Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of questions. First of all, for, I guess, Dr. Sweat, I didn't catch the name of the gentleman, the high-ranking official that you had that discussion with.
You know, I can give it to you. I don't have it off the top of my head. He was a deputy minister. And if I can finish that story briefly, after I confronted him, and of course the answer was basically attack Israel, attack Israel. But I tried to pivot and I said, what if your president, Mr. Morsi, tomorrow were to stand up in a major platform and say, enough, this is a shame, this is a stain on our character, no more, I will not do it, and we will not tolerate it among leadership in our government, and it needs to end. You know, I said, well, the next day he would be lauded from every capital for, standing up, courageously speaking out, trying to change in a high-profile way this infection within the body politic of the Muslim world, and that this would be a very positive thing. In sharing that conversation the following day with a group of reformers in Egypt, they gave a very, very disheartening and disturbing response. They said, yes, but the day after he said that, he'd be assassinated by his own people, which was sobering, to say the least.
Okay. My colleague here, Mr. Meadows, was asking for action items, and I think, is it Massimino? Is that how we're saying that?
Yes.
I think you made the comment that the Saudis have been basically promulgating anti-Semitism through their education literature. Do I remember that right?
That's right.
So how do we get in, are you actively engaged in getting NGOs to go into countries and to combat this at the very lowest levels, including preschool care, kindergarten, if you will, and up? Are you actively engaged in trying to employ the help of those people, the churches? I don't know what all kinds of organizations would be in those countries. You're coming to us and you're saying you need our help, and rightfully so, and I want to be, count me as being part of that help. But are you doing more than that? Are you going into the countries? Are you talking to people, to NGOs, to churches, to synagogues? Part of Americans' history was that when King George was really doing a number on us back in colonial days, the preachers in the churches stood up and spoke out. And I think we need that kind of groundswell and that kind of support from ordinary citizens. Are you going after that kind of support?
Well, it's a very good point. I think that, and behind it, I think, is that this idea that change has to come from within these societies and at the ground level. And in fact, we've talked to a lot of people in countries where this kind of education has taken hold, and there are many, many who are dissatisfied with that, but have few alternatives. It's a massive societal problem, and one that I think the U.S. government could do a lot to address with funding of the local groups who want to make a difference. There's a limit, I think, to what organizations like mine that sit in New York and Washington can do on the ground there, but I can tell you that there are a number of people. This is not something that needs to be imposed from outside. There are plenty of people on the ground in these countries. They are fearful, but they need support. They're not getting support in their own countries. And many of the countries, this is a circle of repression that you, Mr. Chairman, know so well, with governments who try to cut off funding for those progressive groups who are trying to make a difference, and they need to seek funding from outside. So that's something that the United States can be doing, is supporting the various civil society groups, religious groups, education groups, and others who are trying to promote a more objective and invest in the long-term education of their children.
Okay, let me put you all on the spot. If the Saudis are indeed engaged in that practice, and I have no need to doubt that you're correct, would you also, I'm going to put on my energy hat for a minute. I think that if America becomes energy independent and we don't export dollars to the Saudis in exchange for energy, then it actually helps us on two fronts. Would you agree? And would you help spread the word that America needs to be energy independent? I'm going to proselytize y'all from that end. Can I get an amen?
Amen.
Amen.
All right. I see that my time's expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Weber, thank you very much. I want to thank our very distinguished panelists. Because of time, I will be submitting, and I'm sure other members as well, questions. If you could get back to us with those answers. You've provided us incredible insights and suggestions, and I hope that many members read this record. It will be widely disseminated, and thank you so very, very much for your testimonies. I'd like to now welcome our second panel to the witness table, beginning with Dr. Thomas Falegi, who began his career teaching law and government in Hungary. He went on to become a research fellow at Harvard and earned a PhD in the United States. After teaching, he worked in the private sector before joining the Hungarian government to serve as Minister of National Development and then to lead Hungary's financial negotiations with the International Monetary Fund and European Commission. We'll then hear from Mr. Willie Silberstein, who has served as the chairman of the Swedish Committee Against Anti-Semitism since 2009, where he works to counter anti-Semitism through education.